Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we will be analysing the important news appearing in the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 27th January 2020. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. Now this news appears as an article on page number 10 and is titled The Four Phases of Constitutional Interpretation. Now yesterday, Constitution of India completed 70 years since it came into force on January 26, 1950. Now while applauding the achievement of the Constituent Assembly to draft and design such a humongous constitution, the author in this article has used this opportunity to speak about how the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court over these 70 years. Hence, this discussion of ours is important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 under the category of Indian Constitution, Historical Underpinning, Evolution, Features, Amendment, Significant Provisions and Basic Structure. Now, the first phase happened during the early years of Constitution interpretation. And in the early years, the Supreme Court adopted a very textualist approach. That is to say, it interpreted the Constitution in a very strict and textbook kind of a manner, where it focused on the plain or strict meaning of the words used in the Constitution. The biggest testimony to this phase is the A.K. Gopalan case of 1950. Now in this case, the validity of the Preventive Detention Act was brought into question. So basically in this case, the argument was that the Supreme Court has the power to question the reasonableness of the Preventive Detention Act, especially in the light of Article 19, Article 21 and Article 22. So the main argument was that the word law in Article 21 does not merely mean a law enacted by the Parliament but also includes principle of natural justice. Hence, it stated that the preventive detention law, which deprives a person of his life or personal liberty, cannot be valid unless it incorporates the principle of natural justice in the procedure laid down by it. However, the Supreme Court rejected all these arguments and stated that Article 19, 21 and 22 cover entirely different subject matter and all these articles have to be read in a strict and in a separate manner and cannot be read together. So the basic idea behind the first phase was that the Supreme Court gave a very plain and strict interpretation to the words used in the Constitution. The second phase is where the Supreme Court started to focus on the overall structure and the essence of the Constitution. And the biggest example of this case is the Keshwanand Bharti case of 1973. Now during the 1960s and the 1970s, the most controversial question which came up in front of the Supreme Court was whether there is any limitation on the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution, especially the fundamental right. And finally, in the Keshwanand Bharti case, the Supreme Court put this question to rest and stated that there are certain basic or inalienable features of the Constitution which includes the fundamental right, and such features of the Constitution cannot be amended even by the Parliament. So basically, the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution is not unfettered. That is, there is certain restrictions upon it, the biggest one being that the Parliament of India cannot override or change the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, which in turn hold the essence or the soul of the Constitution. Furthermore, in this phase, the Supreme Court also rejected the earlier stance taken by it in the A.K. Gopalan case, and in the Mehaq Gandhi case of 1978, the court clearly stated that fundamental rights are not to be read alone. Rather, the fundamental rights are cohesive bill of rights. That is to say, they constitute very comprehensive right and hence they ought to be interpreted in a wide manner. Following this stance of the Supreme Court, the fundamental rights in India, especially the right to life, was interpreted in a very wide manner and started to include various other range of rights such as clean air, speedy trial, free legal aid, etc. Hence, through this approach, where the Supreme Court focused on the overall structure and essence of the Constitution, the Supreme Court of India started to play a very important role in the governance of the nation. Now, before we go on to discuss the phase 3, what is to be kept in mind here, as has been pointed by the author, is that till the second phase, all the questions related to the interpretation of the Constitution were actually decided by the Constitution bench, comprising of 5 or more judges. So because of this procedure, there was less presidential confusion. By this, what we mean that before phase 3, whatever question related to important matters of interpretation was directly sent to a Constitution bench comprising of 4 to 5 judges. So if these judges gave some important interpretation or a decision on a certain matter, next time if any other case related on that same precedent used to come, that case too used to go to a Constitution bench or a higher bench. So because of this, there used to be less confusion as far as precedents are concerned. However, what started to happen in phase 3 is that the strength of the Supreme Court was increased from mere 8 judges to 31 judges. Currently we have 34, but in phase 3 particularly, the strength was increased to 31 judges. So because of the increase in strength, the Supreme Court started to sit in panels of 2 or 3 judges, and this transformed the Supreme Court into a group of dozen sub-Supreme Court. And now even on matters of constitutional importance, 2 to 3 judges used to give their decision. So because of all of this, the Supreme Court in a way started to move away from precedents and started to give decision on what it thought was correct. Now basically the highlight of phase 3 is what the author describes as Panchayati electicism. The literal meaning of the term electicism is the practice of deriving ideas, styles or taste from various or diverse sources. So the practice, particularly in the context of the Supreme Court, where the judges of the Supreme Court started to derive their decision or the judgment based upon various sources rather than one source, is known as electicism. Now the main feature of the third phase is that the Supreme Court became very result oriented in nature. And in this process, Supreme Court many a times did not engage in giving proper reasoning for their decision. What they focused on was the end result of that judgment, and many times they were not able to give a very coherent reason behind them arriving on a particular decision. So this was the major feature of the third phase. And the reason for this is, firstly, as we have discussed, the strength increased of the Supreme Court, because of which dozen sub-Supreme Court was formed, where a panel of 2 to 3 judges started to give their decision. So very logically, since more judges are there, more different decisions were arrived upon. In addition to this, in this phase, the Supreme Court started to decide case based on a certain conception of its own role. That is, the Supreme Court thought itself to be the guardian of the democracy and the fundamental right. Therefore, in that process of protecting the democracy and the fundamental rights, the Supreme Court just started to give away decisions without actually giving proper or cohesive reasoning for it. And because of all these factors, eventually there was a lot of inconsistency the way the law was being interpreted. And the reason for this inconsistency is, firstly, that a lot of panel of judges were there, so more the panel, more different opinions. And secondly, the Supreme Court focused more on result and less on the reasoning. Hence, inconsistency arose because different bunches of the Supreme Court started to adopt a different approach. Now finally, the phase 4 comes, and currently we are transitioning from third phase to the fourth phase. And in the fourth phase, the Supreme Court is focusing on what was the actual purpose of the Constitution. So in the fourth phase, the Supreme Court has realized that rather than strictly interpreting the Constitution or interpreting the Constitution very liberally, what the Supreme Court should focus is on the actual purpose of the Constitution. That is the intention with which the Constitution makers drafted such a humongous Constitution. Further, the author has stated that the intention of the Constitution makers wanted to come out with a Constitution which nudged or forced people to leave their old habits and do away with the status quo and better their lives. Hence, the Constitution makers looked upon at the Constitution as a source of social revolution and transformation which will bring about grassroots changes. So with this intention in mind, the court is now beginning to interpret the Constitution in accordance with its revolutionary and transformative potential. So the court now has recognized that the Constitution of India has the potential to revolutionize and transform our country, and therefore now the Supreme Court is interpreting the Constitution in that way only. And this phase is reflective from the various judgments of the Supreme Court in the last 2 years, whether it was decriminalizing Section 377, triple talaq, or doing away with adultery, and many other cases. However, in the conclusion, the author has again gave a note of caution and has stated that the facet of phase 3, that is inconsistency in interpretation of law, still kind of lingers in the fourth phase, because whenever a substantial question of interpretation of the Constitution has come up, for example, the National Register of Citizen question or the electoral bond question, such important questions of constitutional interpretation are still being heard by a panel of 2 to 3 judges, and therefore there is a lot of risk that these panel of 2 to 3 judges might give their own decision based on their approach, based on what they think is right. Hence, the Supreme Court should now come out with a method where it should ensure that whenever a question of substantial constitutional interpretation comes up, it should be dealt by a bench of Supreme Court, which gives a very cohesive and coherent reasoning for its decision, and that the Supreme Court should ensure that it should not slip back again to phase 3, because whatever achievement the Supreme Court has made in the phase 4 will then all be futile. So this was all about this article. Let's take up our next news. Now this news has been taken from page number 9 and it is titled "The Hype Over Hypersonics." The context of the news is that recently Russia has deployed the Avangard, which is a nuclear-capable hypersonic boost glide missile. Hence, in this regard, we will be talking about what is a hypersonic weapon, how does a hypersonic glide vehicle work, the difference between subsonic, supersonic and hypersonic, and why is this an important event. Now, this discussion of ours is important from the perspective of science and technology, both for the prelims as well as for mains paper. Now, as stated, Russia has recently deployed the Avangard. Now, the Avangard basically is a hypersonic glide vehicle. Now, in this article, I'll be using vehicle and missile interchangeably. Both actually mean the same thing. So, the Avangard basically is a missile which is in the form of a glide vehicle. Now, this Avangard travels at the speed of 20 Mach, that is 20 times the speed of sound. Further, it is capable of hitting a target in excess of 6,000 kilometers. This missile is capable of carrying both nuclear or conventional payloads or warhead. And another very notable feature of this missile is that it can be maneuvered and does not follow a fixed trajectory, unlike the other traditional ICBMs. Now, coming to the question, what exactly is a hypersonic weapon? A hypersonic weapon is a missile which travels at the speed of 5 Mach or higher, which means it is at least 5 times faster than the speed of sound. This means that a hypersonic weapon can travel about 1 mile per second. Now let us see how this Avangard or the hypersonic glide vehicle works. Now this hypersonic glide vehicle basically is a re-entry vehicle or a missile. Now initially this missile is launched into the atmosphere mounted over a rocket or an aeroplane. And when it reaches the atmosphere, its warhead are released and then fall down towards the atmosphere at hypersonic speed. Now usually if we launch a missile from the atmosphere towards the earth, the payload of this missile is at the mercy of the gravitational forces, as is the case for traditional ICBMs. However, in a hypersonic glide vehicle, the payloads are actually attached to a glide vehicle which is able to overcome the various shock waves in the atmosphere due to its aerodynamic design, which basically means that it can counter and overcome various aerodynamic forces, and because it is able to glide, it can maneuver while entering the earth. And it is due to this feature that it can maneuver that it is able to overcome various missile defense systems. So here from the perspective of prelims, what you need to remember, due to its aerodynamic design, this Avangard or the hypersonic glide vehicle can overcome various aerodynamic forces and shock waves and is not at the mercy of gravity and can glide and maneuver, which makes it very impossible to be countered by a missile defense system. Furthermore, since it can glide and maneuver, it does not follow any fixed trajectory, unlike other missiles. And it is due to all of these features that till today we have no single missile defense system which is capable of intercepting such a hypersonic glide vehicle because of its high speed firstly, and secondly because of its capability to maneuver and glide. Now, to better understand its security implication, you need to keep two things in mind. Firstly, the capability of a hypersonic glide vehicle to carry both nuclear or conventional payload, and secondly, its high speed and ability to maneuver, due to which it does not follow any fixed trajectory. Now, as you must be knowing, both USA and Russia are nuclear weapon countries. And at the same time, both these countries do not want any kind of erosion in their nuclear deterrence. Now, deployment of a hypersonic glide missile brings ambiguity in detecting the type of warhead it is carrying. That is to say, if Russia attacks USA, then this missile is attacking towards USA. The US forces from the grounds cannot detect whether this hypersonic glide vehicle is carrying conventional warhead or whether it is carrying a nuclear warhead. Furthermore, since it has the ability to maneuver, the adversary will also not be in a position to determine what will be the exact destination of this missile. That is to say, the adversary will not know what is the actual target of the missile. Now, due to this ambiguity in detecting the type of warhead and detecting the destination of the missile, the adversary, that is the country on whom this missile will be launched, gets into a trigger-ready situation, which basically means that the adversary will always be on its toes and ready to counter and take down this missile the moment it detects it in the sky. Hence, this can lead to escalation and then finally even can get into a full-blown nuclear war. The second issue with the hypersonic glide vehicle is that it may trigger arms race. Now, we have already seen the arms race during the Cold War, and this missile may again trigger an arms race because now the USA is also trying to develop such a hypersonic glide vehicle and is also trying to strengthen its anti-missile defense system. And this may bring instability in otherwise stable arrangement that we are seeing today, especially between USA and Russia. Another implication of this development is that it can lead to militarization of outer space, and this again may destabilize the global dynamics in the future. Last but not the least, you should also know the difference between subsonic, supersonic and hypersonic. Now, subsonic missiles are the missiles which are slower than the speed of sound. That is, they travel around a speed of 0.9 Mach. Whereas a supersonic missile is the one which exceeds the speed of sound, that is 1 Mach, however is not faster than 3 Mach. Last but not the least, hypersonic missiles are the one which travel above the speed of 5 Mach. So this was all about this article. Now let's take up our next news. This next news appears on page number 12 and it is titled Palestinians Threaten to Quit Oslo Accords. Now in this discussion, we will be talking about what was the Oslo Accords. However, please note here one thing, that the Israel-Palestine issue is a very large one and is part of a static syllabus in the world history. Hence, we will not be going into the issue, but will only focus on the Oslo Accords from the perspective of the prelims. Now, the context of the news is that Palestinian officials are threatening to withdraw from the provisions of the Oslo Accords signed in 1993 if Donald Trump announces his West Asia plan in this coming week. Now, Mr. Trump's West Asia plan will turn Israel's temporary occupation of the Palestine into a permanent one. Now, here on the left side, you can see the map of Israel. All the territories in brown color are Palestine controlled, whereas the one in the white color are Israel controlled. So from this map, we can basically deduce that Palestinians basically occupy West Bank as well as the Gaza Strip in Israel. Another thing from this map which you need to know is the countries which border Israel. So that is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan as well as Egypt. And on the west, it is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. Now in 1992, the much more liberal Labour Party came to power in Israel. And this raised hopes of better relation with the Palestinians. Hence, after a lot of negotiations on both the sides, the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993 between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization or the PLO. Now, the term of the Oslo Accord were firstly, that Israel formally recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Furthermore, even the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and promised to give up terrorism. Thirdly, Israel agreed to give Palestinians limited self-rule or limited autonomy in the areas in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Furthermore, Israel also promised that it will withdraw its troops eventually from both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Hence, it was this Oslo Accord which first spoke about the two-state solution. And this Oslo Accord was brokered by USA and Russia. However, this accord failed when in 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu became the Prime Minister of Israel and he never accepted the agreement reached in the Oslo. And then eventually the situation kept on deteriorating and there was further violence and outbreak of civil war. Another thing, one of the major shortcomings of the Oslo Accord was that it failed to solve the problem of Jerusalem. Therefore, Oslo Accord bypassed several vital questions such as the status of Jerusalem, the right of the return of the 1948 refugees, as well as the future of the Jewish settlement in the areas occupied by Israel since 1967. However, this is too much in detail. Mainly from the perspective of the prelims, remember the terms of the Oslo Accord and one of its major shortcomings, that is, it did not say anything about the Jerusalem question. And again, from geography point of view, remember the location of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And remember, West Bank is bordered by Jordan. So this was all about the Oslo Accord. Let us take up our next news. Now this news appears as an editorial on page number 8 titled Black and Green. Now the context of the article is that recently the Asia Pacific group of the FATF met in Beijing. And during its meet, they cleared Pakistan on 14 out of 27 action plans which were prescribed for it last year when the FATF plenary grey-listed it in October 2019. Now, during the Asia Pacific group of FATF meeting, it was declared that Pakistan had made progress in its effort to avoid blacklisting, and this in a way has now disappointed India, which wanted that Pakistan should be put in the blacklist. Now, Pakistan was put on the grey list by the FATF in 2018 and thereby it had directed Pakistan to take a 27-point action with respect to terror funding and money laundering. However, in the meeting of the Asia Pacific group of the FATF, the stand against Pakistan has been softened, and one of the major reasons for this is that USA is again in peace talks with Taliban. Now, for Taliban to agree to any kind of peaceful intra-Afghanistan settlement or dialogue, USA requires Pakistan to play a major role. Because without Pakistan's help and support, peace in Afghanistan cannot be ensured. Hence, due to this new development with Afghanistan, especially Taliban, the US-Pakistan relationship have again improved in the recent time. And this explains the softening of stand of the West countries, including US, UK, Germany, France, etc. Now, given the softening of the stand, blacklisting is very unlikely for Pakistan. Furthermore, to come out of the grey list in which the Pakistan was put in October 2018, Pakistan requires extra 12 votes in addition to the support it is already getting from China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia and West Asian countries. So this is the latest development as far as Pakistan and the FATF is concerned. Now we have spoken about the FATF and its grey and black list in detail earlier. So let us just revise that lecture again. From the perspective of the syllabus, it will fall under GS paper 2 in the category of international relation and under the subcategory of important international institutes and agencies. Further, this topic can also be related to the external security of India. The FATF, that is the Financial Action Task Force, is an intergovernmental body which was established in the year 1989 by the G7 group of countries in Paris, France. In the year 1989, when the FATF was constituted, it was formed with the intention to examine and develop measures to combat money laundering. But then later, in the year 2001, the FATF also incorporated terrorist financing as one of its mandate. So currently the objectives of the Financial Action Task Force is to set standard as well as promote effective implementation of the legal, regulatory and operational measures to combat three things. One is money laundering, second is terrorist financing, and third is any kind of threat to the integrity of the international financial system. Now, since the FATF develops measures to combat terror financing, it is also known as the International Terror Financing Watchdog. Now, initially, when the FATF was established, it contained only recommendations which intended to provide a comprehensive plan of action to fight money laundering. But in the year 2001, it also started to develop standards to fight against terrorist financing. Hence, currently, FATF has 40 recommendations against money laundering and 9 special recommendations against terrorist financing. Therefore, it is commonly known as the 40 plus 9 FATF standards. So, in the context that the FATF generates a necessary political will to bring about national legislative and regulatory reforms in these two areas, it is basically a policy making body because it provides its member countries with 49 standards to combat money laundering as well as terrorist financing, and further urges them to implement such recommendations and standards within their national laws. Now, how the FATF works is that it conducts peer reviews of each of the members to assess the level of implementation of the FATF recommendations. Further, in its peer reviews, it provides an in-depth description as analysis of each country's system in order to prevent criminal abuse of the financial system. Now, the FATF issues a list of non-cooperative countries or territories, which is also commonly called as the FATF blacklist. Now, under the list, all those countries or territories which are uncooperative in the international efforts against money laundering and terrorist financing are placed under this blacklist. So, once a country is placed under the blacklist, FATF calls on the other countries to apply various countermeasures and increase the cost of doing business with such countries placed in the blacklist, and in severe cases, cutting all ties with them altogether. Currently, Iran and North Korea are the two countries on the FATF blacklist. The second list is the FATF grey list. Now, this grey list consists of all the countries which have deficiencies in their anti-money laundering or counter-terrorist financing regimes. But these countries commit to an action plan to address these loopholes. So therefore, any country which though currently has deficiencies in its laws and regimes to fight these crimes, but at the same time, the countries are ready to follow an action plan given by the FATF, then those countries are placed in the grey list. So some of the countries under the grey list is Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia, Serbia, Sri Lanka, etc. Now moving ahead, as far as Pakistan and the FATF is concerned, Pakistan was put on the FATF grey list in the year 2012 after it was evaluated and it was found that it has certain lacunas and deficiency in its regime. Following this, the FATF suggested an action plan which the Pakistan had to follow. Now in the year 2015, the FATF was satisfied with Pakistan's measure to counter terrorist financing, and therefore it removed Pakistan from the grey list. But then recently, the US along with UK, France and Germany co-sponsored a motion to nominate Pakistan as a country which has strategic deficiency in countering financing of terrorism. So therefore, US along with UK, France and Germany asked the FATF to put Pakistan back on the grey list. So this motion by these countries was passed at the FATF in March 2018, and then in June 2018, Pakistan was placed back on the grey list. Now once Pakistan got back on the grey list, the FATF suggested a 27-point agenda for Pakistan which it had to follow in order to bring itself out of the grey list. Now in October 2018, this action plan was reviewed for the first time, and then now for the second time, the FATF held a week-long meeting to discuss whether Pakistan was able to implement this 27-point agenda or not. And now finally, the FATF has concluded that Pakistan still has a lot of strategic deficiencies in its regime and therefore would remain on the grey list. Now in the previous slide, we had talked about what would be the impact on a country placed under the grey list. and we read that the major impact would be on the country's economy if placed under the grey list. The other impacts are that FATF uses peer pressure through the age-old technique of name and shame, in which it highlights in front of the international community a country which is being uncooperative or is not taking proper measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. So therefore, such name and shame affects the sentiment of the foreign investors and the foreign governments towards that country, finally culminating into adverse economic consequences for that country. But further, you should know that though Pakistan was placed on the FATF grey list from the year 2012 to 2015, but that did not really have much economic impact on Pakistan, because within this period of 3 years, Pakistan was able to complete the IMF program and was also able to garner over $5 billion from the international bonds market. Further, its import and exports also remained stable, which goes on to show that the other countries did not sever relationships with Pakistan and that the grey list did not raise any significant trade barriers for Pakistan. But then again, even if the grey list could not bring much effect to Pakistan, but overall it definitely maligns a country's reputation and may impede investment and business flow for that country. So with this, let's move on to our next news. Now this news appears on page number 1 and it reads, Fund Crunch hits MGNREGA scheme. Now this article is stating already 96% of the annual allocation for the MGNREGA scheme has been exhausted, and there is barely less than 2500 crores left to sustain the scheme for the next 2 months. Now we have already spoken about the MGNREGA scheme in detail, its various features, the problem it is facing, its achievements, and what can be done to improve its situation. So let us revise that previous lesson. From its syllabus, it will form a part of GS paper 2 under the subtopic of government policies and interventions and issues arising out of their design, as well as under the topic of issues related to human resources and the topic of issues related to poverty. Before we talk about the problem of insufficient fund which the MGNREGA scheme is facing, let us very briefly talk about what the MGNREGA is all about. The full form of the MGNREGA is Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. As the name suggests, it's an employment guarantee act which was introduced in 2005 through the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005, but was officially notified in the year 2006. In 2010, NREGA was renamed as the MGNREGA. As far as the aim of the MGNREGA scheme is concerned, it wants to enhance the livelihood security of households in rural India. So the scheme basically wants to provide more livelihood opportunities for households in rural India. Please remember, it is only for rural India and not for urban areas. And it is for this reason that the implementing authority for this scheme is the Ministry of Rural Development. With the broader aim of enhancing the livelihood security, MGNREGA envisages certain objectives through which it basically wants to improve the livelihood security. The first component of the scheme is that it aims to provide 100 days of wage employment per year to every rural household. So here again you need to keep in mind that it seeks to provide 100 days of wage employment not to individual people but to one rural household. Further, the job or the work which is allotted under the MGNREGA is basically to create more durable rural assets. That is to say, the work or the job which is provided under MGNREGA is for the construction of infrastructure like roads, bridges, etc. Hence, in that capacity, MGNREGA provides two things. One is poverty alleviation because it is providing 100 days of wage employment, and second is infrastructure creation as the employment which is being provided is to create durable rural assets. Further, in addition to giving employment, MGNREGA also aims at social inclusion, especially of the vulnerable sections like women, SCs and the STs. Lastly, since the employment has to be provided by the Gram Panchayat in the village, MGNREGA again has the objective to strengthen the Panchayati rural institution in our country. In addition to these components, there are certain important points which you need to remember about MGNREGA. The first is that this scheme is a demand-driven program, which means that worker has to be hired when he demands for a job and not when the government wants it. So basically what happens is that under MGNREGA, a person can go and ask for work, and within 15 days he has to be provided with work. Else, if the government fails to provide him with work in 15 days, then he has to be provided an unemployment allowance. So in that sense, this is the only scheme in a country which is demand driven, because the government cannot refuse work to any person coming and asking for it. So therefore, if the demand increases, then the supply for the jobs also has to increase. Keeping in mind its objective of social inclusion, this scheme mandates that 1/3 of the workers have to be women. Further, not just social inclusion, the scheme also aims at financial inclusion, as now wages are electronically transferred to the worker's bank account or the post office through the DBT system. Lastly, all those assets which are created under the MGNREGA will now have a geotagging. Now that we have understood how the MGNREGA works, let us look at some of the issues or the main problems which are coming in the way of its implementation. The first issue is of insufficient budget allocation. And this is the point which basically has been highlighted in this news article. The news article states that the MGNREGA scheme has been allocated rupees 60,000 crores in the budget of 2019-20. However, this budget which is allocated is lot less than the amount spent under MGNREGA in the current year, that is 2018-19. Hence highlighting the major problem of insufficient budget allocation. Because what happens due to financial crunches, even if people go and ask for work, work is being denied to them because there is no money to actually make payment to them. So eventually the lack of funds is leading to a major gap between the demand and supply as far as MGNREGA is concerned, because though the demand for work is there, the supply of work is not adequate or equal because there is no money to actually make payment to the workers. In fact, various research have found out that in the year 2017-18, the employment which is provided to people under MGNREGA was 32% less than what was actually demanded by the workers. Thus again highlighting the deep contrast between the demand and supply under the MGNREGA. Stemming from the first issue is the second problem of delay in payments. Due to lack of funds, firstly, work is being denied. Secondly, if the work is being provided, the payments are made very late to the workers, making delay in payment another major issue in its implementation. The third point is slowly that MGNREGA is shifting to a supply-driven program. Let us understand why. What happens is that the state government submits a labor budget to the center. A labor budget basically contains the anticipated labor demand for the next financial year in that state. Now the center goes through this labor budget and then approves that labor budget, which is called as the approved labor budget. But of late, what has started to happen is that center has reduced the number of days of work under this approved labor budget and has also put a cap on the funds which can be given out under the MGNREGA scheme. So now, the state governments are not allowed to generate employment above the limits which have been agreed under this approved labor budget. Eventually, in reality, making MGNREGA a more supply-driven program rather than a demand-driven program. Because now the supply side has been fixed and only that much work can be given which can actually be funded by the state government. But this is very much against the principle of MGNREGA, which stated that no matter how much work is demanded by a person, the government ought to provide them with the job opportunity. The fourth point is that under MGNREGA, the wages which are given to the workers are very poor. In fact, the MGNREGA wages are much lower than the minimum wages in most of the states. And this poor wage has actually pushed the marginalized section of our society to take very hazardous and vulnerable jobs. Fifth is another common issue which is found across all states, and that is fabrication of job cards. So basically what happens, the employer creates fictitious workers and in their account books, they show that the payments have been made to various workers, but in reality, those workers do not exist. Now, these 5 are not exhaustive problems which are faced by the MGNREGA. In addition to these 5, other problems are the ineffective grievance redressal, poor quality of assets created, large number of incomplete work, insufficient involvement of the Panchayati Raj institutions, etc. But our discussion would be incomplete if we do not talk about the achievements which the MGNREGA has been able to gain ever since its implementation. The first major achievement is that it has actually an alternate livelihood security for the people in the rural area by providing them with an alternate employment, especially during that time of the year when there is no agricultural activity. MGNREGA has been a powerful instrument for the empowerment of poor women as it has provided them with not just livelihood but a safe and dignified place of work. Thirdly, MGNREGA has also helped in financial inclusion because now the payment of wages is made directly through the bank account or the post office under the DBT. Lastly, MGNREGA has helped with the infrastructure creation in the rural areas, which has led to overall development of the Gram Panchayats. Now, based on our today's discussion, here is a prelims practice question. Please pause the video and solve them. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The first question is with respect to hypersonic glide vehicle. First statement, it has been recently deployed by the United States of America. This is incorrect. It has been recently deployed by Russia. Second, it can carry both conventional and nuclear payload. This is correct. Third, it can overcome gravity by leveraging its aerodynamic design. This too is correct. So the right answer becomes C, 2 and 3 only. Question number 2 is with respect to the Oslo Accord of 1993. First statement, it was an accord between Israel and Palestine. This is correct. Second, it gave solution to the Jerusalem problem by dividing the city into 2 parts. Now the question is asking which of the statements given above are correct. So since the second statement is incorrect, because this Oslo Accord did not say anything about the Jerusalem problem, statement number 2 is incorrect and the right answer becomes A, 1 only. Now this question number 3 was a prelims question which appeared in 2018 prelims examination. The question reads, the term two-state solution is sometimes mentioned in the news in the context of the affairs of. Options are A, China, B, Israel, C, Iraq and D, Yemen. So we know the right answer is B, Israel. Question number 4 is with respect to Financial Action Task Force. First statement, it was established by WTO, that is the World Trade Organization. This is incorrect. It was established by the G7 countries. Second statement, it is specifically established to combat terror financing only. Now this is also incorrect. Though it is right that it combats terror financing, but this statement is incorrect because of the word only. Because FATF also looks into money laundering and other issues relating to financial institutions. So the right answer to this question becomes D, neither 1 nor 2. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's take up the question for the day. Now on request from our viewers, I'm going to read the question for the day for 27th January 2020. Now the question basically reads, which of the pairs given below are correctly matched? And it gives us the pairs of the missile and their speed. The first is subsonic missile and the speed is 0.9 Mach. Second is supersonic missile and the speed is above 3 Mach. And third is hypersonic missile and the speed is 5 or more Mach. Now the question reads, which of the pairs given above is and are correctly matched? Option number A is 1 only. Option number B is 1 and 3 only. Option number C is 2 and 3 only. And option number D is 1, 2 and 3. And the answer for the day for 25th January 2020 was A, 1 only.